Assalamualaikum and very good morning. Welcome to the third webinar hosted by SAT.ASIA. So today's seminar, we are focusing on the aerospace industry post-COVID-19. And with us today, we have Mr. Najib Muhammad Noor and also Datin Shalina. Mr. Najib is the president of Malaysian Aerospace Industry Association, and Datin Shalina is the secretary of the association. So thank you, Najib, and also Datin Shalina for being with us today. It's an honor to have both of you to share your thoughts and musings on the current situation that the industry is facing. So for today's session, we should, following the following format, we'll be discussing on some pre-prepared questions regarding the aerospace industries. And after that, we'll provide some time for the participants to post the questions on the comments of YouTube and to allow for some of these questions to be answered live by our panelists today. So we hope that we can conclude this webinar within 1.5 hours. So let's just start. So Shalina, Datin Shalina and Mr. Najib, today we are in the midst of unprecedented health, sociological, as well as economic crisis globally. And aerospace is one of the worst affected industry, with demands plummeting in air travels. As you can see, big airlines are posting profit warnings, cutting jobs all around the world, grounding their fleets. Recently, we can see Emirates planning to cut down up to 30,000 jobs. Cathay Pacific recently shared that their demands reduced by 96%, while AirAsia, I think, for the whole of April, grounded their fleet completely. So it's totally unprecedented at the moment. It's nothing that we have seen like in the past during the SARS crisis. And obviously, this has produced a domino effect on the overall aerospace supply chain, with airlines now cancelling or postponing their orders, resulting in the decision of the two largest OEMs in the world to adjust their rates as well. So if I can share with you some information that's coming from PwC, recently announced Airbus is cutting down the rates from 1,691 aircraft per year, expected to produce only 799 aircraft per year in 2020. While Boeing, which is affected by the twin effect of both COVID-19 as well as the 737 MAX crisis, is taking even more drastic steps in cutting down the rates. They're currently producing, in 2019, they produced about 835 aircraft per year, and they are forecasting about 278 aircraft to be produced in 2020. Collectively, this represent about 53% reduction in the aerospace supply chain, reduction in orders. So the question here, besides the obvious reduction in revenue and job losses, what do you see, Mr. Najib, as the longer-term impact on countries where aerospace is considered a significant contributor to the economy and a strategic industry at that? And what has been reaction so far from the local aerospace companies, and what has been MAIA been doing in overcoming this crisis?
Okay, so thank you, Hafiz. So I think maybe I'll just give a bit of background on myself, so there's some context for the listeners. So as you quite rightly said, I'm the president of MAIA, but I'm also the CEO of Strand Aerospace, engineering design company. We've been involved with the development of this as outsourcing support for Airbus and Boeing as well, right, in realizing their product. So we do have an intimate knowledge of how the aircraft get incepted when from an idea into a prototype, into a certified aircraft, then into service, into the market, and then into the maintenance side of the business. So the entire value chain, if you like, of how the aerospace business rather than the aviation business works, right? As the association, then we represent also that breadth of capabilities and technologies. So we represent manufacturers, we represent maintenance, repair, overhaul companies, or we represent people who supply consumables and other equipment for both the maintenance and the manufacture of aircraft, right? Yes, I think COVID-19 and its impact is unprecedented. Having said that, Strand is also a consulting company which supports a lot of technology consulting, and I can say, work that we've done for Industry 4.0 previously, and we continue to do now as well for some government organizations as well, has shown that in fact what COVID-19 has done to some degree can be said as bringing forward of the fourth industrial revolution, right? So the way it's disrupted supply chains, the way it's disrupted technology requirements. So that, for example, we're having this webinar now. This is now becoming more popular, in fact, replacing a lot of seminars and reaching a lot more people, right? Now, this is an effect in the sense of COVID-19, but was already expected as part of the Industry 4.0 transformation. So my point there being that I think a lot of what you're seeing now in terms of disruption, you would have anticipated as 5 years from now would have been brought by the fourth industrial revolution, right? So I think that's an important point to make, because that disruption also looks at environmental concerns. So 4.0 looked at greener aircraft, less pollution. So you see the aerospace industry diversifying into electric propulsion, flying cars, all of which are electrically propulsed, or more fuel efficient, less emissions, right? So all of those considerations now again brought forward and happening, unfortunately, all at once. Okay, so I think that's the way we have to look at it. It's actually happening all at once. So will we recover from this situation? I think air travel today, the popular statistic, if you like, it's a broad-based statistic, but it's quite representative, right? We talk about prior to the MCO, our order book being at 40,000+ aircraft that were on order, right? About 60% of that being the single aisle type aircraft, the 73s and the 320s, yeah. Those were enabling what was a lot of the emerging economy. So the statistic is that something like only 20% of the world's population, roughly, has ever taken a flight. So that backlog order was based on this idea of only 20% of the population of the world being accommodated. Therefore, there's a further 80% or so, more or less, that has yet to discover travel enabled by flying, right? Irrespective of what kind of flying that could be, right? So with that, then we talk about the recovery of this industry. It has shown since the early 60s that every crisis, the aerospace industry will recover. It's just a question of time, but usually recover and then resume a double-digit growth path, right? Now, COVID-19, obviously, because of a lot of the environmental impact that might be considered now as part of how aviation and other industries have promoted unhealthy sort of environments, right? Means that there would be initiatives in the recovery for new technologies to be inserted, right? So maybe the greener aircraft and so on and so forth become more prevalent, right? Having said that, the price of fuel also is plummeting. So the cost of operating aircraft is also a lot cheaper, right? So I think the point therefore is what do we do in this interim? And as far as the Malaysian aerospace industry is concerned, the first part we supported a lot the Ministry of International Trade to just get our companies reopened, right? During the lockdown. Okay. Now, from where we sit, we believe that the aerospace industry, due to the rigor that we have in terms of health and safety procedures, processes, and then naturally we are very low manpower operation, right? So it's a high mix, low volume operation. So social distancing is almost natural in an aerospace manufacturing plant or even the MRO operations, right? So we felt that we could be one of those companies that should be able to open earlier, and we were one of, I think, after the electronics industry at the launch of the MCO, given some leeway and some essential industries, the next batch of companies included aerospace. So that's the first thing we did. Now that saved several billion in revenue lost, right? Because we managed to recover that as the manufacturing industry was still delivering on backlogs, so things that still owed. Now the MRO industry, yes, there was some reduction of volume already by then, but they were also, I think, dealing with some of the backlog as well, right? The next step that we are doing now, we are continuously working with the Ministry of International Trade, which has done a very good job of trying to keep on top of the situation, right? Aerospace is not alone. I think we are aerospace engineers, we are aerospace people. We tend to look at this and say, okay, definitely flight has reduced tremendously, but I think long-term, the automotive industry, the E&E industry, the M&E industry, the supply chains have been disrupted in such a way that the current product life cycles cannot continue at the speed that they're going at right now, right? The speed that the product life cycles are, you're getting a new mobile phone model from different manufacturers. Every 2-3 months, there's a new model, right? This kind of product life cycle cannot be sustained, I think, under this kind of potential disruptions continuing, right? So you may have longer product life cycles and you'll go towards the service industry, which means the products will form more of the service and high mix, low volume types of business models, right? You can certainly see that in real estate where now, the Airbnb type of business model would be more favorable rather than building more and more new assets, right? What are you going to repurpose assets for and be flexible about the usage of these assets? So that's really what will be happening coming out of the crisis. So in the meantime, what we're focused on with the government is to look at the immediate retrenchment challenges, right? We predict between 10 to 20% retrenchment in our manufacturing and MRO industries due to the, as you quite rightly mentioned, the reduction in production rates and then the sheer lack of flying, right? So just less aircraft needing maintenance in the immediate term. But what we don't want to do is lose the manpower, because if we lose 20% of our manpower now on the recovery, say 2 years from now, when the rates come back, we want to be one of these countries that will robust enough to retain the manpower so that we can sort of benefit, if you like, from the ramp up on the other side. Okay. So generally, those are our strategies now, MAIA, working with the Ministry of International Trade, Economic Planning Unit as well. But it's not a straightforward situation. I think the ministries are also dealing with many health related issues as well at the same time as industrial issues. So the process is ongoing.
Thank you, Najib. So obviously, MAIA has been working since day one of the MCO. So I was partly engaged in that, and I can see that you and your team has been working very hard behind the scene, meeting the ministers as well as the senior officers, trying to get the operation at least partly operational during the second phase of the MCO, and that has been a success. And I think that has gone some way in mitigating the impact of the revenue loss. So thank you for the inputs on the impact of the industry and how you see that is actually quickening up the pace of the Industry 4.0 adoption or the impact of Industry 4.0 adoptions. And I think we want to circle around that later on with regards to the business model and how the full realization or digitalization of the industry will change the landscape in the future once the pandemic recovers or the demand starts to recover. But for now, Datin Shelina, maybe you can do a bit of introduction about yourself. But my questions for you is on the trends in aviation due to COVID-19, impact on travel. obviously before COVID-19, travel, especially on the low-cost sector of the airlines, has been quite vibrant, especially around the Southeast Asia or Asian region. How do you see that um, the habits or the behaviors of the passengers going to shape up once the COVID-19 starts to recover in regards to the virus spread? And will the airline passengers be afforded the same level of rights and protection if there is any cancellations or flight? Yeah. So over to you.
Thanks, Hafiz. Hi, everyone. Just a bit of background. Yeah, as Hafiz introduced just now, I'm the secretary for MAIA, which is the Aerospace Industry Association. But in terms of my work experience, I was formerly general counsel for AirAsia X from its inception in 2007 until just after the IPO in 2014. Since then, I've come back to practice, and I currently lead the aviation and aerospace practice team at the law firm of Abdullah Chan and Co. And wearing my lawyer hat, I have represented airlines in Malaysia, also represented banks and operating lessors, even engine OEMs, avionics. We also advise on aircraft purchase and sale transactions, including business aviation and general aviation. So that's just a bit of my background in terms of what I do for a day job, in addition to the work that we've been doing on MAIA lately. So I think what's interesting about this question is one of the factors behind the aerospace industry being so resilient has always been that you are not catering to a consumer. If you contrast an aircraft manufacturer with, say, a car manufacturer is very dependent on consumer-driven demand. And we used to distinguish it and say that aerospace is not. Aerospace is dependent on the demand from the OEMs, from the Boeings and the Airbus. And what we are seeing now, because of COVID, is that has slightly changed. So the reason that Airbus and Boeing have reduced their forecast for 2020 and indeed beyond 2020 is, for the first time, I think, more driven by a lack of consumer demand. So what you're seeing is a combination of factors which we have not seen before. So the frequent comparison is made with SARS, is made with the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And the main difference between then and now is that we don't know what's going to drive the cycle back up. So I'll give you an example. Right now, airlines have grounded their fleets, and they haven't grounded their fleets merely due to financial pressures or having to just lay off employees and therefore they can't operate the fleets. But the factors behind the grounding is multitude of factors. You have got border controls. Certain countries have imposed stricter border controls than others. You have restrictions even on crew coming in. So for example, crew coming in certain countries are subject to a 14-day quarantine. That alone impacts on whether an airline wants to fly into the destination or not. You have passengers in certain destinations subject to a 14-day quarantine. So then passengers really have to think about whether they want to travel or not. Closer to home in Malaysia, even for domestic flights, we are told that it's not just anybody. I can't go on a website, buy a ticket and show up at the airport. I actually need to have a reason to travel. So students from Semenanjung, Malaysia were allowed to go back to Sabah, Sarawak. People who are going back to work were allowed to go back, but it's not like before. It's not where anybody could just buy a ticket and get on a plane. So there are a lot of reasons why the demand for travel has fallen. And because the demand has fallen, airlines, in order to save costs, have grounded substantial amounts of their fleet. And not only that, you'll see, particularly in Europe, for example, airlines have made decisions to say, well, now that I'm in a downturn, I'm going to decide that maybe after this, for example, Baltic Air has said that after the COVID restrictions are lifted, they're going to just fly 320s. They're not going to fly anything else. They are letting all their other aircraft types going into early retirement. And I think the other thing that's going to be important in terms of going to push the demand for aerospace is how do we give consumers and passengers the confidence that they can come back, they can fly, and they can feel safe about flying. So I'll give you an example. I just heard today that it was reported in Hong Kong, there's a case of a COVID-19 positive passenger who flew in from the UK to Hong Kong, and he was not able to seek treatment in the UK. He flew back to Hong Kong to get treatment. The minute he landed, he went to immigration and health authorities at the airport and said, I'm positive for COVID-19. So can you imagine the uproar now? People who are on the flight with him are very upset. They don't know, they don't know what risk they were facing. There are already calls to put him in jail, but the reality is he's sick and he needs to be put in treatment. So these are the kind of issues I think we need to raise confidence of passengers. And to a certain extent, you can see every airline group in Malaysia, AirAsia, Malaysia Airlines, Malindo, they've all come out with advisories to do that. So what they're doing is they're telling consumers, this is what we're doing on the aircraft. They're talking about their sanitation and cleaning procedures. They're talking about the fact that the HEPA filters on aircraft are actually the same standard as an operating theatre aircraft. So actually the odds of the virus being recirculated in an aircraft, as I understand, I'm not technical, but as I understand it, are very low. And then they talk about the fact that they do screening and the crew are now being trained how to observe for symptoms. So all these things hopefully will start giving passengers a bit more confidence that they can actually start flying, and that the airlines, and more importantly, the authorities as well, the immigration authorities, the airport authorities are all taking steps. So you can see that for check-in, you've got the 1 meter social distancing. All the airlines in Malaysia, which is a bit different from the US, for example, all the airlines in Malaysia require you to actually wear a mask at all contact points, which means at check-in, you have to wear a mask. When you're picking up baggage and throughout the flight, if you're not eating, you have to wear a mask. So I think depending on how these measures are accepted by the traveling public and how soon the public gets used to this new normal of traveling, that will have an impact in terms of driving demand for airlines. And that in turn, I think you will see driving the demand for aerospace, and indeed just ensuring that whatever order book is there currently, as Najib mentioned, I think 40,000, that all those order books are not diminished so quickly over the following years. I definitely aerospace is more resilient because you have seen a quicker recovery in aerospace. You're already seeing signs of that. So for example, if you look at the latest numbers coming out from IATA and ICAO, Asia Pacific is already ahead of all the other regions in the world in terms of resumption of travel. In Malaysia, we've already got domestic flights coming in. Australia and New Zealand are talking about creating what they call a trans-Tasman bubble. So what that means is travelers between Australia and New Zealand, if they fulfill certain conditions, they don't have to have the quarantine. So these are the kind of measures we're looking at. China and South Korea have come up with a fast-track entry system for travel between 10 specific regions in China and South Korea. So these are the kind of things, I think if the region can do more of that, these are things that are going to boost travel, at least in our region, perhaps ahead of other regions. And interestingly enough, one potential beneficiary of the current maybe contraction of demand for commercial air travel is business and general aviation. Because I think for corporates who still have to travel and who can afford it, they can't afford not to travel, and they can afford to pay those higher prices to maybe travel in a smaller aircraft with perhaps a cap of the number of people, and everyone there is somebody you know, and you have more comfort traveling with somebody you know rather than traveling with hundreds of strangers, so to speak. So that's some of the things on the demand side. Then your question in terms of rights for cancellation. in the newspapers, online, you can see, I think, most airlines in the world, in Malaysia, Tony Fernandez has come out to say, look, I appeal to everybody, please take a credit shell. Don't ask for a cash refund right now. Please take a credit shell. And they've done steps such as to extend the validity of the credit shell to encourage more people to accept that instead of cash, because he says the business needs cash, needs to conserve cash right now. And you're getting mixed reaction from public. Some members of the traveling public are saying, yes, we want to help AirAsia, so we will take a credit shell. Other people are saying, I'll take a credit shell, but what happens if you're not here in 6 months, and do I just burn the value of that credit shell? Yeah, you have, I think, a lot of the larger carriers in the Middle East and even in Europe, they haven't even said anything about a cash refund. They're just telling people, okay, this is what you get. You can change your flight for free. You can, you can have unlimited change for 2 years. So I think airlines are facing that crunch, and they are going to keep trying to persuade the traveling public to accept maybe something which the public would not accept pre-COVID-19. In terms of rights, the rights are enshrined. So in Malaysia, you do have an Aviation Consumer Protection Code in place under the Aviation Commission. And that talks about resolution of things such as lost baggage, delayed flights, cancelled flights. But the reality is, I think everybody acknowledges that at the moment, if those consumer rights were to be enforced strictly, then it would just, impose a bigger burden on airlines that are already facing so many other issues right now.
Okay, thank you, Datin, for very well covered points. So from there, we can see that the customer behavior certainly have to adjust to the new normals, because obviously it's not just the cost that they have to contend with, but it also means the long waiting time. So previously we had to go through the longer than usual security checks just after the 9/11. Perhaps now it's going to be twice as long. Somebody who's trying to get back to Hong Kong, he has to endure close to 8 hours of total additional time in terms of processing and going through the nose swabs and etc. And interestingly, you brought up the point of the opportunities for more regional collaboration. And we can see that it's already happening, not just between Australia and New Zealand, but also in Baltic countries. I think in some of the Baltic countries where the case has gone down, they are creating what they call it a travel bubble or travel corridor between those countries. And it's a good thing that you brought on the issue of shell credit or stock credit for AirAsia, because we are seeing that this approach is not just being adopted by the airlines industry, but I saw it also being adopted by F&B industries, where they offer clients store credit for them to purchase upfront, and the value of that coupons or credit will go up if they defer their purchase. So in a way, help to fund the shortfall of revenue in the immediate terms to make sure that the company is sustainable. I think we are starting to see where businesses are reaching out to the community now, right, in terms of helping for them to be sustained throughout these very, very difficult periods. And I think that goes also some ways in letting the companies to think about how they want to engage the community in future as well, because you would never thought such crisis that big businesses will extend. They need to extend the help from the communities. They need to do almost like a crowdfunding of likes from the communities to help them. So it's a new normal, I suppose, in that sense. Najib, you mentioned earlier about the need for the industry now to accelerate the adoption of the Industry 4.0. And I suppose this is now becoming more urgent given the profound impact of the COVID-19. But as you can see, even with the demand or the rates of the aircraft being produced at the old rates at about 60 aircraft for the narrow bodies, there's still a lot of hesitation, especially from the SMEs, in going to the IR 4.0. Now, where do you think that this opportunity can be converted? Because obviously there'll be further hesitation with regards to the rates not being cut down, right? For them to move to IR 4.0, because you're talking about increasing amount of automation. And where do you think they will be able to assess investment or funding to adopt this IR 4.0? Because obviously there's some initial investment that's required to do this. It is important for companies to be competitive post-COVID, for them to adopt the best practice, to be competitive for companies that are now, the OEMs are now, that are doing more nearshoring. But to get there, they would need that extra help from the government, perhaps, in making the strategic investment. And how do you think that can be facilitated, Maya?
Okay, so let's look at the industrial landscape in the first instance. So remember that a lot of the anticipation for Industry 4.0 was that you had, how shall I say, they would put it as a conservative timeline of 5 years, right, for it to happen, and then optimistic timeline of 10 years, right? I.e., in 5 years' time, they say they were thinking some of it might happen, but not all of it. But in 10 years' time, okay, that's when most of it will probably happen, right? So with that kind of mindset, if you look at the three strata of Malaysian's industry, right? You got the large companies, which includes the GLCs and MNCs. You've got the mid-tier companies, and then you've got the SMEs, right? At the majority of the Malaysian landscape has been built to print manufacturing, right? So I would say that's potentially more than 80% of the landscape is built to print type of work, right? And this is not limited to aerospace, obviously, right? Where aerospace is a little bit different is that it's high mix, low volume, right? As opposed to most of the manufacturing landscape, which is high volume, low mix. Okay. So if I go from the top level, the MNCs, GLCs, and the other large companies, right? This would be at the 300, 400 million and above revenue per annum type of organization. Right now, they're reacting to the rates first, right? Having said that, right before the MCO, you see companies like Spirit Aerosystems, you see companies like CTRM already investing very heavily on automation, right? So in that investment in automation, the productivity gains had already been realized to some degree, and they were increasing the adoption of these technologies, right? So at the large core level, there's been this movement, and now I think the forced retrenchment, if you like, right, in the immediate term, will also still focus them on these opportunities, right? These kind of initiatives. The mid-sized companies, those are the 100, 150 million sort of revenue sort of level. They're not many in Malaysia. Because quite a lot of what we have at the SME sort of level, which is the sub 10, 15 million ringgit per annum revenue sort of company. But those who are there are predominantly machining companies, right? Now that one, we've got a bit of a split in that some of them have done this migration. Some of them are quite diversified. They've got electronics, M&E, and the automotive components as part of their mix of products. Those have been a little bit more sticky, right, with regards to transforming their business for greater efficiency through automation. And then you've got the lowest level, which is the SMEs. And the SME level here, actually, if I compare a Malaysian SME versus, say, a Dutch or German SME, it's a factor of more than 10, in terms of the revenue requirement as a qualifying SME, right? So a qualifying SME in Malaysia generally sits at most of the ones I've seen is at the 2 to 10 million ringgit revenue. An equivalent German or Dutch player would be at the 2-3 million euro revenue as minimum, right? So So much larger in that case. In some cases, up to the 100 million ringgit revenue or 20-30 million euros revenue for SMEs. Okay. So the reason for pointing out that landscape is that I think the listeners should, or the participants in this webinar should understand that the industrial landscape in Malaysia is not the industrial landscape in Europe or America or Japan for that matter. In some very fundamental ways, okay? Because if you want to understand then how the government needs to come in, then you need to understand who is it that they're trying to help, right? So generally not ready for 4.0. I think the data from MAIA and the data from the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers as well is between 10 to 15, 16% readiness as a percentage of the entire industry for 4.0 adoption, right? That was what the numbers were telling us, right? And that's predominantly to do with a leadership that's willing to adopt this and an organization with enough knowledge capability to have 4.0 as part of their operations, okay? So inevitably, the government will have to come in with some sort of subsidy to cushion the blow of investing, right? And shifting from a labor arbitrage business model to an automation enabled efficient business model, right? Because that's a big change in terms of how you operate and how your costs and your profits and your investments are managed. Yeah. So in Singapore, for example, the Economic Development Board Singapore through Enterprise Singapore has coaching programs for up to 3 to 5 years for SMEs, where hand-holding is done for that kind of period of time to do this kind of transformation, right? So what the government will have to do is expand on certain programs that they've already been running, things like SME Corps, aerospace programs for SME. So yeah, I think they're on their now the third batch of 10 companies, so 30 companies now gone through it. Sort of lengthen the period. Right now it's about a 1-year program, so it needs to be lengthened. It needs to have greater depth in terms of its support to these SMEs because they're coming from this challenged background, if you like, right? By the same token, growing the SMEs is important for the sourcing to be done more in Malaysia once the recovery happens, right? Because currently, I think the Malaysian large cos, GLCs, MNCs, they buy maybe 50%, generally about 50% of their product from outside of Malaysia, right? So it's a 50% buy roughly, right? So that's an opportunity to localize into the SME supply chain in country, right? But having said that, a strategic move, we believe at MAIA, needs to be done with the principal, i.e. the Airbus and the Boeing and the Rolls-Royce and the GEs and the Safrans of this world, right? We need to work more strategically directly with them. All these large companies are in pain now. Yeah? They're dealing with unprecedented issues. And I believe that partnership with them at this stage would be potentially welcome, right? And so as a whole, if I paint the picture, summarizing, we need at the top that the government to work with these OEMs on what is the recovery plan over the next 5 years, right? So 2-3 years of downtime and then 2-3 years of recovery, yeah. And then we need to look at the SMEs now and the middle-sized companies and large companies and look at how much we can localize our supply chain, right? How much automation and capability do we need to build, and understand that that's also a function of not just equipment, but people, right? Maturing the people, right? And then as an ecosystem, we have to mature this, understanding how the different parts of it work together. So I know there are MITI people that are listening to this webinar from MATRADE, from MAIDA, for example. I think this is the kind of language that we need to use now with the OEMs who are potentially going to be listening, right? But at the MITI headquarters level, that kind of strategy needs to be put together and then put out to the highest levels.
Okay. Thank you, Najib. Just on that, do you think that there are opportunities now for consolidation of the supply chain locally, or perhaps an opportunity for governments to look for distressed assets overseas that they can actually buy to move some technologies into Malaysia to help make our ecosystem landscape more competitive.
So I think opportunities abound now, right? It doesn't seem to be the natural thing you think about in a crisis situation. By someone said, never waste a good crisis, right? It I think the distressed assets could be in multiple forms, right? It could be a company itself with some very contract or something like that we purchase, and do the transfer to Malaysia. And it could be, in maybe a British company or German company that's distressed at the moment, costs very high to operate, and then this has just pushed them over the edge. You could buy their work, for example, right? So we could buy work. We could also buy technology capability, because I think Malaysia would not be the only one looking at retrenchment, that's for sure. So there's a lot of talent that will be out there in Europe and America, and I think the new norm is that the world is a new place, right? So the kind of business concentrations we had in the past, right? That's where industry was. That's going to shift substantially. I think also a lot of talk about, some people de-risking from China, for example, right? So there's opportunities to purchase capability, as in people, and associated with that, technologies as well. So yes, definitely. And then I think finally, then it's looking at, I think from the further afield in the technology sort of space, right? Purchasing opportunities to be to be part of the next wave of aviation, right? So I always like to use this example, a fantastic Malaysian company, Aerodyne, which is today, I believe, the number one drone services company in the world. Yeah. And they're a services company. They fly drones, but it's services in 26 plus countries globally. They completed their Series B funding a while ago, and they're still growing very strongly now in what is a very new market that's disrupting, what is the market of safety and inspection, right? So people were inspecting pylons, electrical pylons, telecommunication assets before. All physically, people get on ladders and stuff and climb these things, right? So now these guys have an AI drone that goes and like Skynet, and does a summary of what is the issues to do with a whole bunch of assets, in a day, right? So that kind of represents what's out in the forefront at the moment, right? New technologies, but it's on still a small drone. And then we've got aircraft manufacturing, which is traditional, but in between we've got all these air mobility vehicles, and then the different technologies from aerospace that may be enabling things like, the Hyperloop and other kinds of transportation technologies, right? So I think there's an opportunity there to buy into that, particularly now that we consider a lot of the traditional labor arbitrage, cost arbitrage type business models, that foreign labor dependent, right, which is a big chunk of our manufacturing industry, will not probably make it through, this crisis over the next 2 to 3 years, right? So yeah, definitely a way forward there in terms of strategic purchases of assets. Maybe Shalina might be able to say something more about the airline, purchasing airlines or anything like that.
So that is Shalina. Just to follow up on Najib, because what we're seeing now is that around the world, airlines are asking for government subsidies. Obviously, they will go for their the government where they're based at. We're seeing Canadian governments providing some subsidies to the Air Canada wages. US government as well just passed the special bill for the airlines industries. And closer to home, Indonesia government just announced some economic package for the Garuda Air. Now, in Malaysia, we haven't heard anything yet from the government. Strangely, despite the trouble that the industry is in, obviously, airlines itself is airline industry globally is very important. It supports 10 million jobs globally, directly and indirectly support about 65 million jobs. So these are the figures that I got from IATA. And it also strongly supports the tourism industry, which I think contributes about 10 to 12% of our country's GDP. Now, why do you think that the government is still waiting to make an announcement on this? Is there a plan that you personally know of that the government is working on? And maybe we can circle back to Najib's question in whether there is an opportunity for international collaboration when it comes to airlines. Is consolidation of airlines going to happen anytime soon?
Oh, interesting question. Putting me on a hot seat there. Well, I think the talk about what airlines need has been going on a while. I wrote an article which appeared in the Millennial recently on the same thing. In a country like Malaysia, where we are a trading nation, connectivity is really important, whether we talk about air connectivity or land or sea. But certainly in terms of driving business relationships and trade, air connectivity is seen as being one of the key factors. And there's data to show that when a country's air connectivity increases, then their international trade, the connections, the relationships they make, whether just in terms of purchasing and selling or even joint ventures, all goes up in a much higher rate even than those rate of connectivities. And you're right, in Malaysia, tourism and travel is so important. This year was supposed to be Visit Malaysia year. Yeah. I think, the ministry has come out to say that, well, it doesn't look as if we're going to achieve the numbers that we had targeted. Coming back to your question on consolidation, as Najib mentioned, it is interesting, but I think even in the US, with all the difficulties they're going through right now, there isn't much talk of consolidation yet. And I think one of the reasons for that is because different airlines have different business models. So of course in Malaysia, Malaysia is very obvious. You've got AirAsia Group, which is a low-cost carrier group, and then you have Malaysia Airlines, which is a full-service carrier, and you have Malindo, which tries to bridge the gap. So Malaysia Airlines, for example, there was talk since last year about bringing in possible new investors. A couple of names were bandied about. Even at one point, AirAsia's name was bandied about. And recently, with all the issues they've been facing with COVID-19, Malaysia Airlines has come out with various statements to talk about some of the steps they're taking to conserve cash. So for example, senior management is taking a substantial pay cut. They're offering unpaid leave. Junior members of their team are taking a smaller pay cut. It's public knowledge. You can see it on various publications that carriers all around the world have gone back to lessors to ask for a lease holiday or a lease deferral. So all those things are taken to conserve cash. But interestingly enough, Malaysia Airlines, when asked point blank, said we are not considering a consolidation with AirAsia, not considering a merger with AirAsia. And I think that's because, like I said, the business models are so different. Let's just look at a flight attendant, for example. A flight attendant on AirAsia, you've seen them going around with rubbish bags, collecting rubbish, and they sell, they upsell, they try and sell you meals. That doesn't happen on a Malaysia Airlines flight. So the job scope is different. The way they are remunerated is different. So of course, a flight attendant on an AirAsia flight is incentivized to sell more because that goes towards their remuneration. So the business models are very different. Of course, certain things are always going to be the same. Those technical skills that you need as a flight attendant, it doesn't matter which airline, it depends on what aircraft, whether it's a 320 or a 737. Those are the kind of requirements that will determine what technical skills you need. But I think on the commercial skills, on the soft skills side, they are quite different. If we look at an example of a consolidation, let's look at KLM Air France. That's a successful consolidation. And now with COVID, when we talk about government aid, one of the issues that came up is, okay, so which government should step up and to what extent? So what you're seeing in Air France KLM is they're getting a total of 10.9 billion US dollars government bailout. The French government is giving 7 billion euros, which is a 4 billion euro state-backed bank loan and a 3 billion euro direct loan. And the Dutch government is giving a 2 to 4 billion support. So, you know, you're right earlier when you talked about the fact that airlines have to go back to their own jurisdictions, their own government. So here, where you have an airline that crosses borders, then the question becomes which government and how much. So of course, if you think about it, AirAsia, they're in Philippines, they're in Thailand, they're in Indonesia. So I think consumers will rightly ask, wait a minute, if we're going to give aid to AirAsia, is there a way for us to know that that aid is going to AirAsia Malaysia, is protecting Malaysian jobs, and it is not going to the other jurisdictions? So I think any aid that comes out has got to be transparent. Maybe that's one of the reasons it's taking longer. The Aviation Commission actually came up with a position paper recently to say that they felt government aid should be last resort. The CEO of Wizz Air a couple of weeks ago came up publicly and said he believes that airlines should not take government aid because it results in economic inefficiency. But I think for practical purposes, as you say, in Malaysia, we're not just looking at the airline, but we're looking at the entire supply chain. If you relate it back to aerospace, we're looking at MRO, whether it's engine MRO or aircraft MRO or component MRO. So you cannot just look at airlines and say, we don't want to support airlines because it's economically inefficient, but you have to look at all the other jobs, all the multiplier effects that are going to be affected if we don't support airlines. So I don't think, you know, any country is in a position where they can say, we're not going to support at all. We may not all be able to match up to Singapore. I think Singapore is giving something like 7.7 billion USD dollars in total, which is a combination of new equity as well as additional funds raised with the support of Temasek, which is the Sovereign Wealth Fund. But I think we, at the same time, we cannot afford not to support at all. And maybe the key that the airline industry needs to do is they need to be able to be transparent. In the US, you actually have some cases now where the US government is looking at airlines and saying, hey, wait a minute, you haven't been transparent. And if you don't come clean, we may need to take back some of those funds. And they need to be transparent to say, where is that money going? It can't be used to pay bonuses, which I think, you know, is it JCPenney that's come under trouble in the US because the company is going insolvent, but at the same time, they've recently given some bonuses. So I think if the airlines can come forward with a plan and they can prove that they're going to be transparent, the money is going to support jobs in Malaysia, the money is going to protect the aviation and aerospace supply chain, is going to be used to pay off you know, caterers, is going to be used to pay off MRO and fuel and all those things to keep the airline flying. And we still need to figure out the solution for outstanding lease payments, for lease deferrals and things like that. Then I think we'll have a strong business case. And I think ultimately, if Malaysia wants to position itself as an aerospace nation, then we need to have a strong aviation sector, because otherwise, you know, if you think about it, it's not logical. How do we say we're able to do all these things in aerospace and yet we don't have a vibrant aviation sector in our own backyard?
Okay, thank you, Datin. So what we're seeing here is that it's a strategic industry that will require support because of for practical reasons in terms of ensuring continuity and also the economic multiplier impact that the industry has, right? So you're talking about the connectivity of air travel brings, the benefit of the business that it helps generates, certainly is something that the government can't afford to ignore. Najib, your role as MAIA president requires you to engage with the MAIA members that made up of the mid-tier companies, large companies, as well as SME companies. Now, can you recall in the immediate aftermath of the MCO implementation, what has been the reaction of the industries? Obviously, most of them would have gone to a survival modes, but what are the chapters? What are the main issues that the MAIA members are sharing with you that needs attention from the government?
I think the issues are across the board, right? It's not aerospace or SME or ME or large company specific. Yeah. One thing about the aerospace guys, I think in general the last few months has been challenging, but they've been able to keep their heads just above water for that sort of period, right? I don't think the reduction in rate is hit yet, right? It's about to hit, right? So that's not yet impacting, on the shop floor already across the board. I'm sure there's some impact, but not yet throughout, right? Having said that, give it another within next month, then yeah, my guess is that's what's going to happen. So there's a lot of trepidation at the moment with regards to how they're going to plan their businesses going forward. What kind of rate should they be planning for, right? So that's something. Right now Airbus says cut 40%, but is that the end of the story, or how long is that going to be for, right? Because particularly at the SME level, they've invested a lot in getting to where they are. They don't have large numbers of people, just like I said, the aerospace industry is generally a lot of specialist capabilities from the technicians upwards. And so if they take too drastic measures and get rid of people, it's taken them years to build those capabilities potentially. So that's a problem which they're wrestling with, in terms of how to plan for this. So at the association level, what we're trying our best to do is first, as part of working with MITI, we've collected the issues, right, on the ground. We've also collected wish lists from the various companies, organizations. I think we've got a very good wish list, from tax incentives to actual financial stimulus to salary subsidies to actually working strategically with the end clients. All of that's been compiled and now submitted as well to the government for consideration. But I think, to be honest, everybody's, in a sense, in Malaysia particularly, people are focused on what is the new normal, right? Because this thing has affected us in a very holistic sort of way, right? It's not something you deal with only when you go to work. Yeah, it's a business thing. You go home, you go to the supermarket, you go to the toilet even, right? COVID-19 is with you, right? Throughout the thing, you have 1,001 considerations that you had before that you didn't have to have. So people are actually wondering what is the future really, and then trying to position what is the aerospace industry and the part of the industry that they are a part of in that whole scenario, right? That's what people are really, so if you say they're very focused on this, how many orders in the next 2 months, 3 months, whatever, right? Interestingly, obviously the companies that are run by Malaysians do not want to get rid of their manpower, right? So a lot of them are trying to figure out how to keep people. In some cases, where the decision may not be in their hands, they're part of a larger global group, then they're thinking about, well, how can we work with the government to keep these guys employed, right? Because for two reasons. One is that they've taken a long time to build these capabilities. Number two is that the industry, they believe, will come back. And then what do we do? If we start training from scratch 2 years from now, you're going to be on the losing end, right? So it's a lot of uncertainty, I think, in the thinking, and nobody I've seen has focused really on saying, okay, next 2 months will be like this, next 5 months will be like this, next 12 months will be like this, because nobody can say that at this time. And from the airline side, I think Shalina has shared quite a few things there, where what is an airline going to look like going forward, right? In terms of how does it operate, what is its cash management going to be like, right? How do passengers get on the plane, so all of this is changing the perspective on how all these businesses will be run and what their function is. So in summary, we're all kind of working together on a very uncertain picture. But one good thing is there's a very strong solidarity, I believe, in the aerospace industry in Malaysia. Right? People are pulling together. MAIA certainly in the last 2-3 months of dealing with COVID had all its members pulled together, support and come together to be one voice with the industry, with the government.
Right. Thanks, Najib. Datin, it's good to have you back on. I suppose that's one of the new norms, working from home, having to deal with the kids as well. So now we got some questions coming in already from our viewers, and obviously you talk about the needs for us to keep as much as possible the skill labors that we have already developed, that we have taken a long time to develop in the country. And some of the questions that has come in, this is coming from, I suppose, young professionals or recent graduates wanting to embark in the aerospace industry, asking the questions, what opportunities are there, and what should they focus, or perhaps a skill set for them to contribute to the Malaysian aerospace industry. So I open these questions to both of you.
Okay,
Najib, yeah.
I'll start. Maybe Shlina can chip in from the airline or even the professional services, right, perspective there. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not a good time right now to be talking about employment, right? Because actually we're talking a lot about retrenchment at the moment, right? And again, this is not just the aerospace industry. This is across the board, right? I think now for the young people, you've got to look at yourself, irrespective of whether or not, and this has been the trend even before COVID, right? Because 4.0 was already making its mark on the technology industries. You've got to look at yourself as a value adding element to a business. Yeah. So I give you an example, and these are all pre-COVID examples, right? So we had a lot of requests by new foreign direct investors coming to the country, setting up operational headquarters and stuff like that, for people who can support developing and implementing and selling solutions. Okay. Yeah, so it'd be big companies, people like Honeywell, people like GE, right? Now you see that they have evolved to become solution providers with much more touch point with the clients, as opposed to before they were equipment providers, right? So they would be solution equipment providers. Now you actually have to be partnered with your client, right? And the requirement for example, technical sales. Prior to this, technical sales was just a guy with a brochure who understood what the brochure said and went from company to company knocking doors and said, would you like to buy this, right? That was a technical sales, right? So it was more of a charm offensive than it was, a technical offensive, if you like, right? But today, the question that companies need their salespeople to ask the clients is, what business are you doing and how can I make your business better? Right? So when we look at that, right, and that's a sales job, it's become someone who needs to know the technology, needs to know how to implement the technology, needs to understand what a business model is, needs to understand what the potential client's pains are, needs to work with that client to resolve those pains over a period of time while introducing the solutions and coming up with a payment method that's going to work, right? Because it's not just buy something off the shelf anymore. It could be a subscription model, it could be a lease model, it could be so many different things. I mean, just look the difference between AirAsia and Malaysia Airlines business models, how the physical asset of the plane is managed. Very different, the way they manage those two assets, right? So anyone coming into the industry today as a fresh graduate needs to understand that it's almost as an entrepreneurial skill. Right? Everybody, even if you're going to work for a big multinational today, they want you to think like an entrepreneur. Why? Because also a lot of the big multinationals are being attacked, if you like, by the small startup businesses which are slowly taking chunks of their business, right? So So this year we had, I think pre-COVID again, we had the ITAP, Industrial Transformation Asia Pacific, which is part of the Hannover Messe series of trade shows, which MATRADE participates in as well. This is the Singapore chapter. And when we went there, you could see, for example, in the solution space, you have the Siemens solution providers now. Yeah, that's typical. And then you'll have the competitor, Robert Bosch solution provider, GE solution provider, say for virtual reality in oil and gas, right? How to make oil and gas operations more efficient, or even aircraft maintenance more efficient using virtual reality, right? But then you also have Deloitte there, and then you have McKinsey Digital there, and then you have some unknown startup from China, some unknown startup from Singapore, all going for the same pie and offering competitive solutions. And you as a buyer there do not have to go for the Siemens solution. You could go for the startup solution, depending on what it is that you wanted to achieve, right? Based on the budgets that you have, so you have choice, right? And that's actually forcing more the big guys to come down to the level of the small guys, rather than the small guys having to compete up with the level of big guys, right? So if you're coming into this industry, let's say you come into MRO, companies are asking you as a shop floor guy, hey, how can we improve our processes to reduce our operating cost by 5%, And they could be even asking this of fresh graduates who supposedly have been exposed to new technologies and so on and so forth. Whereas, some of their older staff, maybe, 20, 30 years in the business and, maybe just know one way of doing things, right? Yeah. So this dynamic is now forming. I think learning as well, because now it's all online. Again, COVID has proven that online learning is possible. Not very efficient right now. It's hell with my kids at home. But eventually these things will evolve, right? We'll be able to learn things faster online. My 6-year-old daughter picked up PowerPoint over the weekend. She did a PowerPoint on how to save the environment. Her mother was completely flabbergasted. She just went on YouTube and learned how to do it, right? And she had all the ideas in her head already, and she presented a value proposition at 6. So when you look at that, the competition now is very fierce. Now, experience doesn't make any difference, I think, going forward. I think some degree it's about competence. If you can have the same level of competence without the experience, with the same level of experience, you're just as valuable as the same guy or girl with that level of competence, but took 20 years to get it, right? If you can get it in 5 years, that level of competence, you can do the job, plus you've got all these digital aids helping you, right? Then you're just as good as a guy with 20 years experience. And companies will now begin to see that, right? The challenge with a lot of Malaysian graduates is that obviously the rote learning that we've been through for years has got a very linear path in terms of a career, right? In terms of what's in our minds, how we perceive a career. So it's about getting a first job where, and so the question really, I think, is asking where is the first job going to probably be based on the economic situation and how many companies are surviving, right? That's the question. But my thing is that you cannot ask that question, because that question is a very, it's an evolving question now. What you have to think is, how much value do I have to add? Who is it that I can add that value to, and who can I convince that they need that value from me? And I think, Shalina will probably echo this from the legal profession standpoint, because even in her profession, and the kind of complicated contracts that they deal with technology companies, aerospace companies, and so forth, needs another kind of thinking. So I'll let her chip in on that.
Yeah, thanks, Najib. So I think another aspect of my practice, aside from aviation and aerospace, is actually HR. So unfortunately, of course, when the MCO started, COVID started, even before the MCO was imposed on 18 March, you could see companies facing huge cash flow issues, huge revenue issues. So of course, the first thing they start to look at, and the easiest thing to do, is actually cut your headcount, right? So we were consulted on how do we do this. And I think what a takeaway from that for graduates who are looking to come into this is, if there are a handful of you, say 5 of you, who potentially, because you are the last in, so maybe you're the first out to go, or maybe you're still on probation, how do you distinguish yourself from the other people who have been considered is what are you being able to give to the organization? As Najib says, how do you value add? Are you somebody who is using this MCO time at home to, watch Korean drama on Netflix or to brush up your cooking skills? Or are you taking advantage of the fact that so many libraries online have been unlocked? You can access resources for free. You can access MBA online programs. You can access, LSE is giving lectures online for free. There's so many resources that you can access for free. There's so much that you could have done during this. We're now, what are we now? We're already more than 8 weeks. Have you taken this time to improve yourself? In my practice, a lot of the time we work with law firms from overseas, from the UK, from parts of EU, from the US. And interestingly enough, a trend that we're seeing recently over the past few months is they're not just asking legal questions anymore. They're asking, where do you see the industry in Malaysia going? Where do you see the Malaysian government response? In what direction? And how important does the Malaysian government view aviation? And if you're a lawyer who just looks at the law, you will not be able to answer these questions. I know it drives my associates crazy. I always tell them, you have to read the news. You have to keep abreast of developments. I think aviation and aerospace are two industries which are very dynamic. There's always things going on, whether we're talking about, what changes are being made to the MRJ program, or we're talking about, as we talked, as Hafiz mentioned, that some regional airlines in Europe are doing things to create some safe corridors of travel. These are all things which really are very unique to aviation and aerospace. You don't see it anywhere else. For example, if we talk about MRO, there are MRO slots available, and while some airlines are looking at MRO and saying, well, this is one way to save cash, let's postpone my MRO, other airlines who are being a bit more innovative, and perhaps they're driven by engineers who are a bit more innovative, are saying, hey, wait a minute, during this downtime, maybe it's a good opportunity to do MRO, because then I don't actually have to take active aircraft out of service. I can send aircraft which are already down, and then later when I'm ready to fly, I don't have to worry about scheduling an MRO. And these are creative solutions which you won't get from an engineering degree. You won't get from studying anywhere. And some of these you won't even get on the job. But I think nowadays, to show your value add, you have to step up and take the initiative. And whether you're an engineer in aerospace or any kind of engineer, or whether you're a lawyer who hopefully has more business acumen than the next lawyer, there are ways, I think, that that you can make sure you stand out from the crowd. I think, Najib, you mentioned marketing specifically. So let's look at business aviation. In China, business aviation has seen a huge upswing because they are finding that using private jets and using helicopters to get PPE and medical supplies to smaller parts of China where they don't have such a big airfield is actually more efficient, and also, surprisingly in some cases, more cost efficient, to the extent that the Chinese government was offering $1,000 as an additional incentive to business aviation operators who are willing to do this. And this is the first time that the Chinese government has actually kind of recognized and acknowledged the role that business aviation can play in things such as this disaster recovery, medical supplies and all that. So if you think about it, if you're working for a business aviation company, your marketing now is no longer about the fact that maybe it's faster to clear customs and immigration. Maybe you can now operate to smaller airports. In a COVID-19, or rather post-COVID-19, you can talk about the fact that you can fly with people you know. You can fly, and your risk of flying with maybe 10 or 12 is a lot less than flying with 200. And you can talk about the fact that it's easier to sanitize, for example, a smaller aircraft. And I think these are things that you have to be willing to innovate and be creative about. So aside from Industry 4.0, which is frequently touted as being more on the manufacturing side, more on automation, on those kinds of things, I think as individuals and people, there's a lot of opportunities for us to step up, and we need to figure out how we can be innovative in our industry, whether it's legal advisory, whether it's even, for example, consultancy, engineering consultancy, or manufacturing. There are a lot of ways for us to step up and make sure that if jobs are at stake, that our employers would not look at us to go first, because they value the additional input that we can bring aside from what other employees can bring.
Thank you, Shalina. Thank you, Najib. So in a way that helps answer another question that comes from one of our viewers, who asks about how should the companies position themselves for this prolonged downturn. In a way, it's not just the employees, but the employers also have to think about how they can step up the games, how can they be innovative in responding to this new normal. Maybe you can share some use case or some examples of companies in Malaysia that you've seen have been able to pivot themselves through these difficult times, or have started to put a plan in place to make sure they are more resilient and can sustain themselves through these difficult times.
Okay, so there's a company called SAT.
Thank you.
Which I think is a good example. I think you guys have now obviously pivoted your capability to manage big data sets, managing complex electronic data systems as well, as part of the aerospace discipline, and then obviously secure data systems as well to support things like smart farming, right? So I mean, that's a direct pivot, but the key thing here is that you understand what is your core capability, right? So if I take Aerodyne, for example, you see that they've been very heavily involved with the MCO. They've deployed their drones at their own cost, to do the monitoring in hard to manage places, right? Where there's a lot of movement of people which are more at risk in terms of how they move, right? So so with Aerodyne, then that's a business development. There's a business development strategy there, proof of concept, right? On what is a crisis situation, what's the real value that you can get from, and that's an application that's probably new to them in terms of crowd control, right? And it's going to be more and more of a requirement to maintain the social distancing requirements over the next, say, 2 years, right? As we cope with COVID-19. So generally, companies with very deep core capabilities, and they understand these core capabilities and invest in these core capabilities, can do this kind of pivot. So the services companies like SAT, even Strand, we pivoted now to support governments in developing industry rather than just developing aircraft per se, right? And then Aerodyne there in providing from inspection services to crowd management services, that kind of pivot. They're all core capabilities. The manufacturing side of things, there was already movement. A lot of our members at MAIA are people who are from the M&E, E&E industries, doing consumer goods, automotive, oil and gas type parts, who have themselves diversified into aerospace. So companies like T7 Global, big oil and gas company, has now got a T7 Aerospace, which does treatments, right? Celestica, which is used to be only electronics for sort of the mass market. Now the plant in up north is almost 100. I think it's 100% avionics supplier, right? So they went from high volume, low mix to high mix, low volume, right? And then throughout the entire organization, it's massive transformation. So organizations which have strong leadership, strong management of core competence, and understand where their investments and core capabilities are, they will find the new opportunities through this process. Where the companies that will struggle would be the ones which are predominantly just off-takers. That means they've got an asset, physical machinery, so on and so forth. They're dependent on X, Y, Z companies producing larger stuff, which their smaller stuff goes on to. They're going to have a problem, because not only are those companies going to struggle, but the global market may change completely from not having those products en masse, but having those products as a service, So then, there was an example late last year, where a big crane manufacturing company in Malaysia was saying that the One Belt One Road project was no longer buying cranes. It was buying the services of cranes. So making a crane for sale versus making a crane to provide a service is two different types of crane. So they're trying to get their heads around how they would evolve this and what kind of business they would be, right? So I think generally, those who are into aerospace have got ability to handle the kind of technicalities of aerospace, the complexities, the low volumes but high value per product, very low scrap rates next to no scrap rate type of situation. Those guys may be able to pivot more in the new product space. But those in the more mass consumption market, I think that's where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and certainly that's what we see on the ground.
Sorry. So if I can just relate to how SAT.ASIA has been experiencing this COVID-19. So what we're seeing, because we are directly involved with the design work of one of the OEMs in Germany, specializing in general aviation, what we're seeing is they are trying to capitalize on this, because as Datin Shilna earlier highlighted, in future they're seeing demands for more general aviation, because people are trying to avoid the business travelers will still need to travel, and they will try to go point to point and avoid congested air hubs. So there's still strong push for companies in general aviation trying to bring their products into the market, and we are seeing the demands in that as well. So in a way, it's one area that Malaysia as a country has overlooked in the past. But it is seeing a pickup. There is also another program that is soon to be announced in September and October by another German company, but owned by a US company, Sierra Nevada Corporation. So they are looking to relaunch Doni 328 extended version from 29 passengers to 39 passengers. It's just been announced in a German publication. And this will target a very specific market for regional travel. So I guess there's still some investment being made in this subsegment of the market. Now, the other subsegments of aerospace that is still relatively unscarred is the defense industry. Now, this relates to one of the questions from the viewer. Is asking whether Malaysia industry is open to working with an aerospace and defense innovation accelerator. I don't have the facts and figures with me regards to the aerospace industry involvement with the defense sector, but perhaps either one of you can share your thoughts on these questions.
So what was the question again on the defense?
Is Malaysia's industry open to working with an aerospace and defense innovation accelerator?
So you're talking about the defense industry in Malaysia?
I think it's talking about the commercial industry working with defense.
Oh, okay.
Industry. Yeah.
As in the Malaysian defense industry, or
a possible pivot?
Well, I mean, certainly the commercial industry is open to working with whoever, and I think, at Strand itself, we've worked for both commercial and military projects, so that's not. I don't think that's an issue. I think the MRO space also, I know some other companies who've also looked at working as such, like Asia Aerotech, for example, in Subang. They've looked at supporting military aircraft. They certainly support the maintenance of state-owned aircraft, like Royal Transports and things like this. So I think the Malaysian industry generally is open to the military side of things. I think where it's quite different is I think more of the challenge is going to be how is it that the military industry is going to leverage on the commercial aerospace industry. I think certainly at Strand we have been interfacing a lot with the Royal Malaysian Air Force, where there's a lot of engineering requirements that sometimes requires our knowledge on aircraft design, and how aircraft are put together, so that how to understand the maintenance manuals and how potentially these could be evolved, right, to support the version of operations that the RMF might be doing. But in order to do that, there should be a very strong interface. So if you look at Australia, for example, the US, the commercial guys are involved with the military sector, and there's a clear interface between the two, both administratively and, more importantly, technically, right? So yeah, I think there's always been challenges there. There are commercial companies working with the military in Malaysia, but I think there's a lot of companies with new technology capabilities which could be benefiting the armed forces in Malaysia and the region, for that matter. Hafiz, you're mute again.
Okay. So related to urban air mobility, I think there's a question from somebody from Aerodyne. So direct this question to Najib. What do you think about the urban air mobility industry in Malaysia? Is it something feasible economically, commercially, and technically? So maybe you can just give a quick answer.
Yeah. So I think, like most things, right? I'd say, question, is Netflix a feasible business model for Malaysia? Doesn't make sense, right? That question, because it is now taken over Astro, it's taken over everything, right? And certainly this MCO, you've probably seen Netflix revenues skyrocket, and none of that business is done in Malaysia, right? In terms of the transactions are all happening digitally in, Scandinavia somewhere, right? So same with Spotify and music, right? So the question really is the air mobility business viable, full stop? Because wherever it happens viably, irrespective of if it happens in Malaysia, or it happens in the US, or it happens in China, the moment it happens and it is proven effective, right, then it becomes a global phenomenon, because it will be pushed out as a service offering. I think that's the other thing. It's not a vehicle per se, it is a service offering. And since people from Aerodyne are asking the question, then they themselves, right, are a service offering. And once they've got the service offering right, 26 countries plus are now using that service offering, not knowing necessarily where it comes from, right? So today the question, and this is an Industry 4.0 question, we start with the value proposition. Is the value proposition of urban air mobility a valid business proposition, value proposition, right? And from the point of view of urban air mobility probably being electric and less emissions, and urban air mobility potentially connecting to electric regional air mobility, i.e. from here to Malacca, you can fly via electric aircraft, right, at a lower flight level, for example, right, on a set path, right? Then I think both environmentally and economically, and then in terms of just pure point-to-point opportunity rather than going from airport to airport, right, it is potentially a very viable business model, and hence why everybody is invested in it, right? The other thing about urban air mobility, or air mobility full stop, is that it opens up places which don't have necessarily the same kind of highway or connectivity infrastructure. So if you think of the new proposed center of administration for the Indonesia, right, in Kalimantan, if you had urban air mobility, then how many highways would you build into that thing, right? Maybe everybody would just fly in on an electric drone, yeah. So I think everybody's invested in it because of very different reasons, and I think it is something that will happen. Why? Because I believe it needs to happen in order to manage congestion, and more efficient, environmentally effective solutions for travel, full stop, not just air travel, right? The question is simply time and what technologies need to mature and what legislation needs to mature in the time frame as well. So air traffic control for air mobility full stop, and drone operations. That's a big thing. I think Airbus calls it the urban transport system, UTS, right? Or sorry, unmanned transport system, UTS system that the Airbus is investing the building of, which is basically highways in the sky. Okay, so yeah, so the answer to the question is it probably will happen, and don't watch Malaysia for it. Just watch wherever it is it'll happen, and then just watch for how quick it will happen in Malaysia.
Right. Thank you. I think we are coming to a close now, so I'm just gonna share with you one last question, which I think Dr. Sherina can start answering, and Najib can add to that. What is MAIA's plan to help aerospace companies to recover post-COVID-19? And this perhaps related to any incentives or support that you think are available for the companies to weather this crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Hafiz. So I think one of the things that the team at MAIA has spotted very early on is even before COVID, there were no aviation or aerospace specific incentives. There are lots of incentives available in Malaysia under various government agencies and ministries, but there wasn't any that was targeted for aerospace. That's an area that MAIA has been working on. I think Najib will talk a bit more later about what MAIA has been doing throughout this time in terms of getting companies to recommence operations after the initial MCO shutdown of most businesses. But one thing also good about MAIA, what I see a lot of, because I'm on various WhatsApp chat groups, as I'm sure we all are, there's a lot of information sharing. So you can see industry players are sharing information that they get. The MAIA team, of course, the MAIA executive office, and those of us, the minute we have some information, we share it with others as well. As Najib said, it's a very united aerospace industry, and we're not selfish. We don't keep information to ourselves. We share it out, and we see that as well because I'm active on the business aviation front, and I'm also doing some cross-sharing information that I get from there, sharing it in this forum, and the aerospace forum. I'm sharing it over there as well. So I think not just that, when you talk about things like consolidation, when you talk about things such as how do we get through this from a purely company and business perspective, I've given advice on things such as how do we restructure our operations from a legal HR perspective, for example. And I think that's also the kind of sharing where at MAIA level in the past we've helped companies who are maybe looking to place people out or who are looking to employ people. So there's a lot of things that MAIA can do, MAIA has done in the past, and is still ongoing. I think, as Najib said, this was a tough weekend putting together some position papers, and we're seeing that. So I think MAIA has an active role, and hopefully one of the things that I think is going to be positive for MAIA after this is there are quite a few aerospace companies who are not yet members. So Najib, I'm putting a plug for the association here. And I think, hopefully more of because we didn't distinguish, we didn't say we're only fighting for members, we're fighting for the industry, whether or not you're a member. And I think hopefully one of the good things that will come out is that members will see, and non-members also, more importantly, will see that we have been able to be an effective voice and an effective liaison with the government in times like this. And this is when you'll see the value that we bring to the industry. Najib, over to you.
I mean, I think Shina has covered most of it. I think essentially we've put in proposals now, as I said, to MITI. Also, obviously, Dato' Sri Azmin, the Minister of MITI, who's also one of the 4 senior ministers in the Prime Minister's office, is very aware of the aerospace industry. In fact, he championed it very strongly, and he worked with us very closely in trying to get this started up soon, right? The key thing is, we need incentives definitely to begin to work out what's going to happen in the next 2 years. And the key to that is do not lose our manpower, right? We need to retain that in some way, whether it's in the current companies they're in or in other applications or programs that we might have to put together. So really thinking out the box here with MITI and with MIDA, for example, I think very receptive to this kind of ideas. The Economic Action Council, which is the primary advisory to the Prime Minister's office on what the economic recovery is going to be, working closely with the Ministry of Finance. Also, I think they also understand that aerospace is one of these future industries which we need to grow, as some of the more low-cost industries will have to be pushed somewhere else, right? Potentially. So no shortage of support. I think, guys, what we have to understand is this is a crisis, right? Which means everybody is a headless chicken, everybody is running in all directions at this time. So as association, we need to be very strong and keep together and keep pushing a clear picture of how we want to work with the government through these uncertain times. And so as MAIA continues to get feedback from its members and works with the ministries, we should be forging soon, some ways forward, and hopefully it is as per the MCO just in time, the MCO lifting for the aerospace industry, just in time for us to respond positively and come out of the crisis, after 2 years or so, on the upside.
Okay, thank you, Najib. So I think we covered quite a fair bit during this 1.5 hour webinar, and certainly a trying time for all of us, not just the airlines and aerospace industries, but other industries as well. And I think good takeaway points from what Najib has been talking about is how the MAIA Association has been quite proactive in engaging the governments, engaging the members as well, and aerospace industry in Malaysia being a close-knit community as it is, there's a lot of close support from one another in getting us through these difficult times. Now, as we're coming to a close, I would just like to have a quick sound bites from both of you on your hope and what do you think, how do you think that the industry is going to recover post-COVID? What will be the future of aerospace industry in Malaysia? Shelina, maybe.
Well, I think echoing some of the questions and some of the discussions we've had here today, really is it would be great if the government would come out with some initiatives specifically to help aerospace. As Najib talked about, that's important to keep Malaysia's capability, our talent intact, because there are long lead times and high barriers to entry for aerospace. We can't afford to lose that capability now. Secondly, what aid is going to be given to the aviation industry, because as I've said, maintaining the aviation industry is important to Malaysia for so many ways, international trade, connectivity, but of course, you need to have a strong aviation industry so that that will also drive the global aerospace demand. And job retention is going to be very important for both these industries. And I think that's going to be an area that needs to be looked at and needs to be focused on. Yeah.
Okay, so I think from me, we have to embrace that, sounding like a cliche, the new norm, right? But understanding what the new norm really means as what is going to happen in the future, right? I think as aerospace organizations, we have built into us business continuity programs, measures, right? Risk management measures. And if you look at the AS 9100 standard, it says, have you accounted for risk associated with, everything which I believe COVID-19 will fit in one of those items, right? It's in there, right? I think it's under environmental disaster even, right? So as an aerospace industry, we are required to think of what can go wrong and how do we always improve through whatever situation that we come through. And at the forefront of technology with aerospace, we're able to then invent new methods of transportation. So we talked about air mobility, right? People are talking about the Hyperloop, we're talking about, today's planes that we are manufacturing, maybe more electric planes in terms of electric propulsion for the current aircraft. So these are the kind of things Malaysia needs to embrace. We need to embrace that this is coming. This is coming, and the demands on us, like we talked about to the graduates, are to become the people who create that future. If we are still going to stick on the mindset of we are going to be waiting for people to write that future for us to have a gravy train ride on it, then we are not the new norm. We are the old stuff or the old crap that's about to go out with the new norm coming in, you know. And I think that's a very stark reminder after, you know, so many years now in Malaysia, and then as the president of the association for the last nearly coming out 4 years now. That's the bit that industry must embrace and go forward with that sort of vision, you know. So so I hope that's how we respond as a country, you know. Otherwise, I used to say before, you know, at the very least we have our beaches, right? But I think COVID-19's kind of screwed that one up as well. So so, you know, we kind of stuck with having to get it done. You know, it's kind of like Koreans and Japanese and so on and so forth after the Second World War, right? No natural resources and all that, and they built fantastic technologically based economies. That's what we got to do.
Thank you very much, Najib. Thank you very much, Dr. Shelina. I think it's a good sharing session just now. Certainly learn a lot from both of you in the thoughts that you shared with us, and I hope the webinar has been quite beneficial for those who tune in. I think it's going to be a very interesting time, a new norm for us to acquit ourselves with. The key thing here is also adaptability and resilience. I think as human beings, we are generally quite resilient. Now, the question is how quick can we adapt to these new norms with the challenges that lies ahead. So with that, I would like to end this webinar. Thank you so much, Najib and Dr. Shelina again. We hope we can do this at some other time with a different topic perhaps in mind. Thank you.